No, I don't.
And all tied together. It's
Right.
the first that I'm reading my husband's last and final book that he wrote.
It didn't happen in public. No announcement. No press conference. No warning. Just a quiet update, buried in legal records. And yet, within hours, everything began to unravel. A trademark. A name. A brand. An identity that had been carefully built over time. Suddenly, no longer under the same control. And at the center of it all, Erika Kirk. Because according to some reports, that trademark didn't just expire. It shifted. Allegedly transferred to Charlie's family. And that's when everything changed. Because this wasn't just paperwork. It was power. Control over a name that had become deeply tied to a story still filled with unanswered questions. But here's where things get strange. Because the timing doesn't make sense. The filings. The silence. The sudden disappearance of key updates. Almost like something was happening behind the scenes, faster than anyone could track. And if you were watching closely, you'd notice something even more unsettling. The moment the trademark changed hands, so did the narrative. So the question is, was this a legal move? Or the final piece of something much bigger? Before the filings, before the sudden shift in ownership, there was a story that most people only saw in fragments. A name that kept resurfacing in different contexts. Erika Kirk. To some, she was building something legitimate. A brand. A narrative. A presence. To others, according to online speculation, she was connected to something far more complicated. But nothing was clear. Because from the outside, everything looked controlled. Carefully curated updates. Strategic appearances. Moments that felt intentional, almost rehearsed. And then there was Charlie. No full identity publicly confirmed. No clear background. Just a name that kept appearing alongside key moments. Sometimes in posts. Sometimes in discussions. Always slightly out of focus. But here's where things get strange. Because despite Charlie being central to the narrative, very little was ever said directly. No official statements. No verified interviews. Just references. Fragments. And a growing sense that Charlie's role was being minimized. Or perhaps managed. And then everything changed. According to some reports, early documents tied to the brand, specifically the trademark, initially appeared to be aligned with Erika's direction. Ownership, control, future expansion. It all pointed one way. But behind the scenes, something else may have been happening. Because according to online discussions and alleged insider commentary, there were disputes. Quiet ones. Not public. Not acknowledged. But persistent. Concerns about ownership. Questions about rights. And most importantly, who the name actually belonged to. And that's when Charlie's family enters the picture. Not loudly. Not with statements. But through filings. Subtle. Legal. Precise. According to some interpretations of those filings, they weren't just observing. They were positioning. But here's the unsettling part. Because at the time, almost no one noticed. No headlines. No viral clips. Just paperwork. And in situations like this, that's often where the real shifts begin. Because while the public focuses on visible moments, the real control moves quietly. And then, the first hint of conflict surfaced. Not in court. Not in interviews, but in a message. A screenshot, unverified, but widely shared, allegedly showing a conversation referencing an authorized use of a name tied to Charlie. No confirmation. No context. But enough to spark curiosity. Because if that message is even partially accurate, it suggests something critical. That the name, the identity, the brand, may never have fully belonged to Erika in the first place. And that changes everything. Because if control was never absolute, then what we've been watching wasn't ownership. It was a temporary hold. And if that's true, then the trademark transfer wasn't sudden. It was inevitable. But here's the real question. Why now? Why did everything shift at this exact moment? Because once you start looking closer, you realize something unsettling. The trademark didn't just move. The timing aligned with something else entirely. And that's where the first real layer begins. The moment people started connecting the timing, everything intensified. Because it wasn't just about a trademark anymore. It was about when it happened. And what else was happening at the exact same time. At first, the connection seemed subtle. Easy to miss. But once a few users pointed it out, it couldn't be ignored. Because just days before the trademark reportedly shifted away from Erika Kirk, something else surfaced. A series of posts. Short. Cryptic. Allegedly coming from accounts tied, directly or indirectly, to people familiar with the situation. No names confirmed. But the language. Specific. One post read, "They knew this was coming. That's why everything went quiet." Another, "It's not about losing control. It's about losing the right to the story." And that's when everything changed. Because suddenly, the trademark wasn't just legal paperwork. It was narrative control. Who gets to tell the story? Who owns the name attached to it? And who decides what version becomes public? But here's where things get strange. Because alongside those posts, new evidence began appearing. Not official. Not verified. But detailed enough to feel real. Screenshots of alleged internal messages. Blurry. Cropped. But with phrases that raised questions. Deadline missed. Filing window closed. Counterclaim initiated. Legal language. But out of context. Which only made it more intriguing. Because if you've ever seen something like that, you know how it feels. Incomplete. Like you're looking at a piece of something bigger. And that's exactly what people started doing. Piecing together fragments. Trying to reconstruct a timeline. Trying to understand how control over a name could shift so quickly. And then, a voice note appeared. Unverified. Distorted. Shared briefly before disappearing. In it, a voice, identity unknown, allegedly says, "They waited until it was vulnerable. Then they moved." No explanation. No confirmation. But the implication. Clear. That this wasn't accidental. It was strategic. And that's when the tension escalated. Because if the timing was intentional, then someone had been watching. Waiting. Monitoring the situation closely enough to act at the exact right moment. But here's the unsettling part. Because another layer started emerging. This one quieter. More technical. Users began digging into trademark databases. Public records. Filing histories. And according to some interpretations, there were gaps. Moments where renewals should have happened, but didn't. Deadlines that were allegedly missed. Opportunities that, for reasons unknown, weren't taken. And that raises a critical question. Was it negligence? Or something else? Because in high-stakes situations like this, deadlines aren't usually missed by accident. Especially not when control of a brand is involved. And then, a new theory began circulating. According to some online speculation, the delay wasn't a mistake. It was a distraction. A calculated pause. Designed to create a window. A moment where ownership could be challenged. Or transferred. Without immediate resistance. No proof. But the pattern. Hard to ignore. Because every time something surfaced, it was followed by silence. No clarification from Erika Kirk. No immediate response from Charlie's family. Just stillness. And in that stillness, things moved. Quietly. Legally. Irreversibly. And then, the reaction started. Online communities split into two sides. Some believed Erika had been blindsided. That control was taken unexpectedly. Others argued the opposite. That this had been building for months. That the warning signs were there. Just ignored. But here's where things get even more complicated. Because a third perspective emerged. One that reframed everything. According to this view, no one was surprised. Not really. Because behind the scenes, everyone involved allegedly knew the situation was unstable. That ownership wasn't fully secure. That the trademark was contested. Even if it wasn't publicly acknowledged. And if that's true, then what we are seeing now isn't a sudden collapse. It's the final stage of something that started much earlier. But then, another piece of evidence appeared. A document. Allegedly part of a filing. Partially redacted. Difficult to verify. But containing one phrase that stood out. Primary rights associated with Origin Party. Origin Party. Who is that? Charlie. Charlie's family. Someone else entirely. Because if the rights were always tied to an origin party, then Erika's control may have always been conditional. Temporary. And that changes everything. Because it means the brand was never fully hers. At least, not in the way people believed. And that realization, it shifts the entire narrative. From loss to reversion. From collapse to correction. But here's the problem. Because even that explanation doesn't answer everything. It just raises new questions. Why was this allowed to continue for so long? Why wasn't ownership clarified earlier? And most importantly, what triggered the final move? Because something did. Something pushed this situation from tension to action. And whatever that trigger was, it hasn't been fully revealed. At least, not yet. Because what happens next doesn't just add more detail. It introduces contradictions, conflicts, and a level of complexity that makes everything before it look simple. At this point, the story should have reached clarity. A trademark shifts. Ownership changes. Case closed. That's how it usually goes. But not here. Because instead of resolution, everything became more complicated. More layered. More unstable. Because the deeper people looked, the more contradictions they found. And that's when everything started to spiral. It began with a response. Not an official statement. Not a press release, but something smaller. A post, allegedly connected to someone close to Erika Kirk, that appeared briefly before being deleted. In it, one line stood out. "This isn't over." No context. No explanation. Just a signal. And that was enough. Because suddenly, this wasn't a completed transfer. It was a conflict. But here's where things get strange. Because almost immediately after that post surfaced, another one appeared. This time, reportedly tied to individuals aligned with Charlie's side. Different tone. More controlled. Allegedly stating, it was never theirs to begin with. Two completely opposing narratives. Both confident. Both claiming legitimacy. And neither providing definitive proof. And that's when the story fractured again. Because now, it wasn't just about what happened. It was about who gets believed. And that's where tension escalates. Because once narratives collide, the truth becomes harder to isolate. And then, a new detail emerged. One that changed everything. A filing update. Small. Technical. But significant. According to some interpretations, the trademark wasn't just transferred. It was reclaimed. Reclaimed. That word matters. Because it implies prior ownership. Original rights. A history that predates everything we've seen publicly. And if that's accurate, then the entire situation flips. Because Erika didn't lose something she built. She lost something she was temporarily holding. But here's the unsettling part. Because that interpretation isn't universally accepted. Some argue the wording is ambiguous. Open to interpretation. Possibly even strategic. And that introduces a new layer. Language control. Because in legal battles, words aren't just descriptive. They are tactical. Designed to frame perception. And that's when another angle surfaced. This one even more complex. According to online speculation, there may have been multiple agreements. Multiple understandings. Some formal. Some not. Verbal arrangements. Informal permissions. Situations where control was shared, but not clearly defined. And if that's true, then both sides could technically be right. At least, from their own perspective. Which explains the conflict. But also deepens the mystery. Because if ownership was unclear from the beginning, then why was it presented as stable? Why did everything appear so controlled, for so long? And that's when a new figure enters the narrative. Not publicly confirmed. Not officially named. But referenced in multiple discussions. An alleged intermediary. Someone who may have been involved in early decisions. Early agreements. The initial structure of how the brand was handled. No identity. Just fragments. Mentions in posts. Blurred screenshots. A single initial that keeps appearing, but never fully explained. And according to some theories, this person may have been the one who connected everything. Erika. Charlie. The trademark itself. And if that's true, then their role could be critical. Because intermediaries don't just facilitate. They influence. They shape agreements. They define boundaries. And if those boundaries weren't clear, then the entire structure becomes unstable. Which brings us back to the present. Because while all of this is unfolding, something else is happening. Silence. From both sides. No detailed statements. No direct explanations. Just minimal updates. Controlled communication. And in that silence, speculation grows. Because when information is limited, people fill the gaps. And the gaps in this story, they are massive. Because even now, we don't know who originally filed the trademark, who maintained it over time, what agreements existed behind the scenes, or what triggered the final shift. All we have are fragments and interpretations and conflicting narratives that refuse to align. And then, another twist. A report, unverified, but widely discussed, suggesting that additional claims may be coming. Not just about the trademark, but about usage, representation, possibly even financial aspects tied to the brand. No confirmation, but enough to raise stakes. Because if that's true, then this situation isn't stabilizing. It's escalating. And that's where everything reaches a breaking point. Because once legal tension meets public speculation, the story stops being controlled. It becomes volatile, unpredictable. And that's exactly where we are now. Because what comes next doesn't just complicate the narrative. It forces you to question everything you thought you understood. By now, it feels like everything has been revealed. Ownership disputes, conflicting narratives, alleged missed filings, a trademark that no longer sits where people expected it to be. But just when the story seems complete, a detail emerges that doesn't just add to the situation. It redefines it. It began with a document, not widely shared, not trending, but quietly circulating in smaller circles. Allegedly part of an older filing, predating everything people have been discussing. Unverified, but specific. And inside that document, one phrase changed everything. Conditional authorization granted under limited scope. Read that again. Conditional authorization. Not ownership. Not full rights. Permission. Temporary. Restricted. And suddenly, the entire narrative shifts. Because if this document is even partially accurate, then Erika Kirk may have never owned the trademark in the way people believed. She may have been operating under permission, authorized use, a controlled allowance. And that changes everything. Because losing ownership implies something was taken. But losing authorization implies something was revoked. And that's a very different story. But here's where things get strange. Because right after that document began circulating, another piece surfaced. A message, allegedly from someone connected to Charlie's side. Again, unverified. But the wording, chilling. It was always temporary. They just didn't expect it to end like this. Temporary. Which aligns perfectly with the idea of conditional authorization. And suddenly, two separate sources, one technical, one conversational, are pointing in the same direction. Not confirming, but reinforcing. And that's when everything shifts again. Because now, the focus moves from what happened to what was understood. Did Erika believe she had full control? Or did she know the arrangement had limits? Because if she knew, then the narrative becomes strategic. A calculated expansion within a limited window. But if she didn't, then this becomes something else entirely. A misunderstanding, a miscommunication, or something even more complex. Because another theory began circulating. This one more controversial. According to some online speculation, the arrangement may have started informally. A trust-based agreement. No strict enforcement at the beginning. which would explain why everything appeared stable. Why there were no early conflicts. But over time, as the brand grew, as visibility increased, as stakes became higher, that informal agreement may have started to break down. Expectations shifting, interpretations diverging, until eventually, it couldn't hold. And that's when the formal structure, the legal framework, stepped in to redefine everything, to clarify ownership, to enforce boundaries that may have been ignored or misunderstood. And if that's true, then what we are witnessing now isn't just a legal shift. It's the collapse of an agreement that was never fully defined. But here's the most unsettling part. Because even this explanation doesn't resolve everything. It introduces a new question. Why wasn't this clarified earlier? Why allow the brand to grow if the control was always conditional? Because in situations like this, clarity isn't just important. It's critical. Unless the ambiguity served a purpose. And that's where the story takes its darkest turn. Because some believe, again, unverified, that the lack of clarity wasn't accidental. It was strategic. A way to allow growth, while maintaining ultimate control. A structure where one side builds, and the other retains the right to reclaim. At any moment, under specific conditions. And if that's true, then this wasn't a collapse. It was a trigger. A condition being met. A clause being activated. And that's why everything feels so sudden. Because from the outside, it looks like a fall. But from the inside, it may have been planned all along. And that changes everything. Because now, you're not just watching a dispute. You're watching a system, executing exactly as it was designed to. But what happens when that system is exposed? When people start questioning not just the outcome, but the structure itself. That's when things stop being controlled and start becoming chaotic. The moment that theory took hold, everything destabilized. Not slowly, not quietly, but all at once. Because once people started believing that the entire situation may have been structured from the beginning, every detail became suspect. Every action reinterpreted. And suddenly, no one trusted the narrative anymore. Online discussions didn't just grow. They split. Some argued Erika Kirk had been outmaneuvered. That she built something real, only to have it pulled away. Others pushed the opposite. That she knew the limits, and pushed past them anyway. And a third group. They stopped focusing on individuals entirely. And started questioning the system. But here's where things get strange. Because as that shift happened, visibility changed again. Posts that were gaining traction. Suddenly harder to find. Threads that were active. Locked. Comments filtered. At first, it felt random. But then, patterns appeared. Certain discussions faded faster than others. Certain angles stopped trending. Almost like the conversation itself was being redirected. And that only made things worse. Because when people feel like information is being controlled, they push harder, dig deeper. And that's exactly what happened. Alleged insiders began posting again. Anonymous accounts. No verification. But detailed enough to feel real. One claimed, "This was always going to end this way. The timing just caught people off guard." Another, "They didn't lose it. It reverted." That word again. Reverted. Not taken. Not stolen. Returned. And that single word changed everything. Because it aligns with the idea that the control was never permanent. That what we saw as ownership was temporary positioning. And if that's true, then the collapse isn't surprising. It's expected. But here's the unsettling part. Because even as these theories spread, no one directly involved clarified anything. No full statements. No detailed explanations. Just controlled silence. Minimal responses. Carefully measured updates. And in that silence, the story began to fragment. Because without clear information, every theory feels possible. Every version feels plausible. And that's when the chaos peaks. Because now, there isn't one narrative. There are dozens. Some saying this was strategic. Others calling it a legal correction. Some believing there's more still hidden. And maybe there is. Because one final detail surfaced. Small. Almost overlooked. But powerful. A reference, buried in a discussion, suggesting that this may not be the final step. That additional claims, additional shifts, could still be coming. Unverified. But enough to raise stakes. Because if this isn't the end, then what we are seeing now is just the beginning of a larger unraveling. And that's what makes this moment so unstable. Because nothing is settled. Not the ownership. Not the narrative. Not the future. Everything feels suspended. Uncertain. And in situations like this, uncertainty is the most powerful force of all. Because it keeps the story alive. Evolving. Unresolved. And possibly still unfolding. So where does that leave us? A trademark that allegedly shifted hands. A narrative that refuses to settle. And a story that feels less like a conclusion, and more like a turning point. Erika Kirk is still at the center of it all. But no longer as the clear owner of the narrative. Just one part of something much larger. Because what started as a question of control has become a question of structure. Of how things are built. How they are allowed to grow. And how, at any moment, they can be taken back. Or returned. Depending on how you interpret it. And that's the problem. Nothing here is fully confirmed. Everything sits in that space between possibility and proof. Between what's alleged and what's real. But here's the question that won't go away. If this was always conditional, if control was never absolute, then how many other stories, how many other brands, names, identities are operating under the same kind of invisible framework? Because once you start looking at it that way, this stops being just about one situation. It becomes something bigger. A pattern. A system. One that most people don't see. Until something like this happens. And by then, it's already too late. So now it's your turn. Look at the details. Revisit the timeline. Question the assumptions. Because whatever really happened here, it's not as simple as it looks. And the next shift might already be happening. Quietly. Just like the last one.